Hi students, my name's Hannah, and today we're going to be looking at hand tracing, specifically hand tracing loops within loops. This example problem I got from a CS300 practice exam, but I believe this would still be applicable for later weeks in CS200. So we're going to jump right in. So as you can see here, we are working with a list of 3 strings, just simple one-letter strings A, B, and C. So the first part is just initializing those two. So we'll initialize the list and the result. And I'm just keeping track of everything down there. So for our first for loop, the outer for loop, we are, instead of starting out with I equals 0 like we usually would, we're actually doing the list.length. So this is just looking at that length of the list, which in this case is A, B, and C, so 3. With each iteration, we'll be decreasing opposed to increasing. And then for the inner for loop, it's more like the normal for loops you see where you start at 0. And this inner for loop goes up until you reach list at the point I minus 1. And since I is 3, that's at list 2. And since it's a 0, 1, 2 scale opposed to 1, 2, 3, that 2 position would be at C. And actually, since we're looking at the dot length of that specific spot in the list, we're not actually looking at the full list length. We're actually looking at how long that individual string is. So how long C is, which is 1. So just looking at this, since A, B, and C are all length 1, we know that for this inner loop, we're only going to be going up to 1. So that's just pretty handy to keep in the back of your head if this was a practice exam or a real exam and you want to be able to work through this faster. And just knowing no matter what, that for loop is only going to run one time, because once you hit j equals 1, then you were kicked out of that inner for loop. So now that we're in that for loop, we're going to go to the if, and we have if j is less than the list j length. So right now j is at 0, so if 0 is less than j position, so that j position is A, and the length of A is 1, and that's true, 0 is less than 1, then we can add a result. So that result is 3, parenthesis, and then the list at 3 minus 0. So that'd be the list at 0, which is A. Now we go back up to that for loop, the inner for loop, and do j++, so our j turns from 0 to 1. And just like that, we are butted out of that inner loop, since 1 is no longer less than 0, so like the length of list at I minus 1. And we head back out to the outer loop. And now that we have kind of forgotten about that inner loop and we've moved back to the outside, your j suddenly vanishes. It's no longer initialized, so I just wrote that down there as does not exist. So now that we are at that outer loop, we are going to decrease I by 1 because of that I minus minus. And that brings us down to I equals 2, and that is still greater than 0, which is that limiting part of the for loop that keeps us within the for loop, so we can keep going to the next part. And the next part is that inner for loop, and now j is reinitialized as 0, and just like the last portion, we will add on the result to B, so I is decreased to 2, and then B is that position at 3 minus 2 minus 0, so at position 1. And then the same thing happens when you increase j again to 1. 1 is no longer less than list I minus 1 is the length, which is 0, and then we start that for loop again. I'm just going to click through this. You can work this out on paper by yourself, but it's the same pattern as before. However, the only thing that changes now is that once we get back to the outer for loop and decrement I from 1 to 0, you're no longer agreeing with that inner statement that I is greater than 0, because I equals 0 right now. And because of that, we don't go into that for loop, and therefore neither into the inner for loop either, and just go straight past it to that system out print, and we print out the result. And the result is 3a space 2b space 1c. Hopefully you were able to follow along with that first example pretty easily. This is pretty much the same example, except that I changed our list of strings from ABC to AA, B, and C, 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 C. So if you're looking ahead, you'll be able to figure out how this would change the algorithm, but we'll walk through it anyways. The outer for loop is the same as before. We start at list length, which is still 3, which is greater than 0, and then we keep in mind that we'll be decrementing it. From there we move to the inner for loop, and this is where things change a bit. J is still initialized to 0. However, our list at index I-1 is no longer always going to be a length 1, since we have length 2, 1, and 4 because of the AA, 1B, and then 4 Cs. So now we actually have to keep better track of that. So for that first example, J is 0, and then J needs to stay less than list at position 2's length, because 3 minus 1 is 2, and that 2 position, the length is 4. We pass that requirement and hop into that for loop, and we look at our newly initialized J, which is 0, and check that it is less than list at position J, and right now that is the AA, and so we look at that length, which is 2, so 0 is less than 2, which is correct, so we add that first part of the list. Or sorry, not the first part of the list, we add the first part of the result, which is 3, parenthesis AA. From there we move back up to that inner for loop and see that J, even though it's been incremented 1, is still less than the length of 4 C's, which is 4. So we go to that inner if statement, and it asks if J is less than list at position 1, and in this case that is B, which is of length 1. So we see if 1 is less than 1, which is not, so we go back to the inner for loop, increment J by 1, it is still less than the length of that C, 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 so we go back to the if statement, and here's where things start to change a bit. So if J, which is 2, is less than the list position at 2, which is that C, 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 which it is, then we go into the if statement. But here, when we try to do that list at position 3 minus J minus 1, we see that 3 minus 3 minus 2 is equal to negative 2, which is actually going to throw an exception, specifically an array index out of bounds exception, and that is what caused this portion of code not to run in the first place. So as you can see, by being able to hand trace, we can understand not only why your code didn't work, but also where it didn't work, which is something you can't always see if you were to copy and paste this into Eclipse, for instance, and just see that the code didn't run. Thanks for watching and listening, and I hope this was helpful.